Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ara McCauley. I'm the Operations Manager for Kingston WritersFest, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the BookLovers Lunch. This is the final in our bi-weekly series of pre-festival events, so thank you for joining us. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we are gathered for this online event is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. We gratefully acknowledge these Indigenous nations for their historical and ongoing guardianship of this land. We agree to peaceably share in the responsibility for stewardship of this land, its waters, and all of its biodiversity. All those who come to live and work here are responsible for honoring these relationships in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Thank you to Joanne LaChapelle-Bayac, author patron of Ben McNally, and a very special thank you to Union Kitchen in Kingston, purveyor of today's delicious lunches. A reminder, as always, that copies of all of the books Ben mentions today are available for purchase at Novel Idea in Kingston, in person, by phone, or online order for pickup or shipment. Just search Novel Idea Kingston, and also, of course, at Ben McNally Books in Toronto, and that's benmcnallybooks.com. We'd love to know where you are as you join us for this event. Please let us know using the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. You can also use this function to ask Ben questions, which we'll hold in the last 5 to 10 minutes of the event. I do want to remind you that the festival starts a week from today, Wednesday, September 23rd. Be sure to check out our festival lineup at kingstonwritersfest.ca/event and get yourself registered for some of our amazing events. Please feel free to start enjoying your lunch, and I'll give a brief introduction of Ben and then turn the proceedings over to him. Ben McNally, historically known as the Book Baron of Bay Street and proprietor of Ben McNally Books in downtown Toronto, has been a bookseller for 4 decades and is renowned for his discerning taste, his encyclopedic knowledge, and his energy as a literary impresario, organizing highly successful reading events and book launches year-round. In the past year, Ben McNally Books has undergone some big changes and now makes its home on Adelaide Street, where Ben's kids have joined him in the business. Ben traditionally attends Kingston WritersFest BookLovers Lunch with his partner in life and business, Lim Thompson, author of Birding with Yeats, which won the Edna Stabler Award from Creative Nonfiction. Because the festival wouldn't be the same without the BookLovers Lunch, we're thrilled that Ben agreed to go virtual with us this year. Please welcome Ben McNally.
Thanks, Ara. How we doing? We're okay? Like the tech is okay? Everybody's going to be all right?
We're all good. Yep.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Ara. Thank you, Barbara Bell. Thank you, Kingston. I'm so sorry that I'm not there. My appearance at the Kingston Writers Festival, as I'm sure I've told you before, really one of the highlights of my literary year. I love being there. I love the audience, and I hope that this is not too disappointing. I'm doing it from the store, and the advantage to that is that I'll be able to hold up copies of each of the books before I talk about them, and the disadvantage is that sometimes the phone will ring, and the good news is that I won't have to answer it. The first time I did one of these Zoom things from the store, the phone was ringing and I just had to let it ring, and it's unbelievable how long people will let a phone ring before they give up. So that was mildly disconcerting, but the real problem was when the delivery guy showed up and I actually had to interrupt my little blather to get up and answer the door. So that won't happen here either. And because I'm not eating, because I'm not enjoying those lunches that I read about, we have a little bit more time than usual, and so I added a few books. You'll see that there are 32 books on this list rather than the usual 25. And I think really one of the other upsides to this technique is that I won't realize I'm running out of time with 10 books to go and have to jam them all through in a huge hurry. So we'll start with a nonfiction, and the first book is a book from last year, and I was thinking, because I see you in September, that it's possible that this book would have been overlooked by everybody. And you know, I think this is really a beautiful and spectacular book, A Month in Siena. And Hisham Attar wrote a book called The Return, and in which he returned to Libya to try and find out what had happened to his father. And he was unsuccessful. His father had been kidnapped and disappeared. And that book won the Pulitzer Prize, yes, it won the Pulitzer Prize, and it's an extraordinary book. But this book, he went to the town of Siena, and he went there for a kind of break. He really needed to recover from that sort of trauma of having to write that book. And I showed you this is a really nice little book. It's really spectacular. One of the reasons he went to Siena was because of the art, which is quite unusual. And but the book is about Siena. It's about him. And if you haven't been to Siena, one of the interesting things about it is that its main square is on a bit of a slope. So no matter where you stand in it, you can see all of it. And I just love this book. I found it meditative, and I found it extremely enlightening, and really a sensitive look at a whole lot of different things. The next book is by Erik Larson, and it's called The Splendid and the Vile. And you know, Erik Larson has actually done pretty well for himself, writing about the Second World War and about you know, Britain in particular. And this particular one deals with Winston Churchill himself and what he did at home during the course of the war. So you know, he lived in Ditchley, and he lived in Chequers, and of course he was at 10 Downing Street, and so this turns out to have been an extremely popular book. You know, I think Churchill has a lot to answer for, but a lot of people are quite capable of painting into Churchill's life and career a lot of different ideologies. So I found it very interesting. And of course, heroic in the extreme. Our next book is Ben McIntyre's book, Agent Sonia. This just published on Tuesday. And here's another guy who's mined a very fruitful streak. Mining a streak, I guess that's not really how you do it, but he's made quite a career for himself writing about espionage, particularly Russian espionage. And this is a story about a woman who lived in the Cotswolds during the war, elegant, 3 children, and who happened to be an extremely important and influential spy during the course of the war. And it you know, it doesn't have the same kind of narrative propulsion that The Traitor and the Spy had, but it does nonetheless satisfy in every regard. Bill Buford's in it. A bit of a mental case, I have to tell you that. His new book is called Dirt, and he wrote a book called Heat, in which he went to a dinner and Mario Batali was there, and he decided what he would do would kind of fasten himself to Mario Batali and try to learn how to cook. And so that was a book about cooking under Mario Batali. And of course, Mario Batali is in not particularly good odor at this point. But nonetheless, that was a pretty interesting book about the pressures of cooking at a high level with a lot of high expectations. And the new book, Bill Buford decides that in order for him to find out about French cooking, you know, and what it is about French cooking that is so singular and significant, that he would go to Lyon and try to find out, study under a couple of people there. The really interesting thing is that he goes with his wife and kids, and they play absolutely no part. Like, he seems to completely disregard them for most of the book, and that's kind of the way he does it. He's very single-minded, and but nonetheless, this is a really interesting book. He is a very good writer, and has been an editor in the past. His first book was was a book called Among the Thugs, which is about British hooliganism in football, and it was another extraordinary book. He manages to get himself into, he manages to sort of immerse himself in whatever he's writing about. Coffee Land by Augustine Sedgwick. This is a really interesting book in its own way, and not just about coffee, which is interesting. You know, you can't go anywhere without your cup of coffee these days. It seems like every time you're walking along the street, people have a cup of coffee and their telephone in their hand, and you wonder how that came to be. Well, this book will unlock some of those secrets, but it's also a book about El Salvador, which is great coffee country, and it's about one particular guy named James Hill who emigrated from Manchester and founded a sort of coffee empire, and he did so by using relatively inhumane methods, and which of course redound to this day in terms of political dissatisfaction in El Salvador. Francesca Way, this book called Square Haunting, and it's about a little square in London called Mecklenburgh Square, and between the wars, it was home to 5 different extremely influential British women writers, for the most part. H.D., the poet, Dorothy Sayers, the detective writer, Virginia Woolf, Jane Harrison, and Eileen Power, the historian. It's not like they hung out together, and in fact, they hardly ever crossed paths, but it's just interesting that this particular place was a sort of nexus for some people who turned out to be so influential. Hadley Freeman's book, House of Glass. Now, this has been a hugely successful book for me, and it's one of those fascinating stories. Hadley Freeman was a writer, and she knew that her grandmother had lived in France during the war, but she didn't know very much about it. And so often you hear these stories about people who lived during extraordinary times and didn't want to talk about them ever again. And so Hadley Freeman, after her grandmother died, she found a shoebox in a closet. And in that shoebox, there were some letters and a photograph, and one of the letters was from Pablo Picasso. And so she decided to see what she could find out about the contents of this shoebox, and then subsequently about her grandmother's life. And this is a beautiful book, really, really satisfying, and biography at its very finest. Sarah Seeger, it's an unusual book by a very unusual woman, and she grew up in Toronto. She went to St. Clement's and then decided that it was a better fit for her at Jarvis Collegiate. And she became an astrophysicist, and not just an astrophysicist, but one of the preeminent astrophysicists in the world. She got a MacArthur grant, and she really is one of the extremely most important astrophysicists in the world. And I don't want you to think that I know any more about astrophysics than you could roll into a ball and stick in your ear. But nonetheless, I found this book absolutely fascinating. And as you know, as usual, when I get to things that I don't know anything about, I just say, okay, I'll give you that interesting part about astrophysics. So if you happen to have a special interest in astrophysics, this is going to be way more interesting for you throughout. But the really interesting part for me about this book was the sort of number of obstacles that she managed to overcome. And it's kind of not until you get to the very end of the book that you find out just how serious some of those obstacles actually were, even more serious than she would have expected. here's another woman with a quest, Maria Konnikova, and her book is called The Biggest Bluff. And for reasons which I don't think they're ever really abundantly made clear, but she decided that what she wanted to do was become a very successful poker player. And you know, not just getting around with the girls on a Friday night for a few beers and a few hands, playing, you know, penny ante or, you know, buck a hand or anything like that. She wanted to go to Las Vegas and be like the #1 poker player in the world. And it's not like she had a lot of background regarding poker. I mean, you know, she wasn't brought up in a gambling family or anything else like that. And in fact, her grandmother was quite dismissive of this whole idea. But she thought if she was going to do this, she would see if she could find some very famous and successful poker player to be her mentor. And miraculously enough, she managed to do that. And she managed to get a guy named Eric Seidel, who's in the Poker Hall of Fame. Who knew that there was a Poker Hall of Fame? But anyway, she managed to convince Eric Seidel to teach her the kind of fundamentals of big stakes poker. And so, you know, the very first thing he said to her was, you know, she said, okay, where do I start? He said, pay attention, pay attention. And the book is about playing poker, but it's also about paying attention. It's about how you manage to delude yourself from time to time into something that you know isn't really a great idea. And so it really is a book about how to live your life. And you don't always have to be going all in to do that, but it's more than a book about playing poker, although poker is the background to this woman's development. Sophie Roberts, another woman on a bit of a quest. For some reason, she was interested in pianos, and she was interested in Siberia, and so she went to Siberia to try and find some of these pianos, and they were taken like Siberia is like a bigger than, it's not just a penal colony, but it's a gigantic part of Russia, and a lot of the exiles, you know, they didn't necessarily live in the gulag. They lived in towns, and they did have a few comforts of life, one of which was a piano. And so she traveled through Siberia trying to find some of those pianos that had been abandoned, that had fallen into disuse, whatever. And so she went to various places, and it's a book about pianos, but it's also a book about modern Siberia as well as his historical Siberia, and quite successful in that regard. Kapka Kasabova wrote a book called The Border, which was one of my favorite books a couple of years ago, when she went into an area of the Balkans, which sort of spanned Greece and Turkey and Bulgaria. And this is her new book, and she sort of moves over to the east, where there are two lakes, and they're in Albania and North Macedonia. And the reason she went there is because that's where her family came from. And so as well as being a history and a geography of you know, these places have been populated for thousands of years, and you'd think that they might have come to terms with each other, but at this particular time, not just on our side of the planet, but also throughout the rest of the world, it seems as though attitudes are hardening. And that's one of the things she was interested in, that people who've managed to get along one way or another for thousands of years suddenly are finding themselves not getting along. Excuse me. Robert Kolker wrote this book called Hidden Valley Road. Excuse me. And this is a remarkable book. And you can see, I don't know, you probably can't see on here, but there's a group of children coming down this staircase, This is a story of the Galvin family, who had 10 children, and 8 boys and 2 girls, and 6 of the boys had schizophrenia. And this is back in the 50s when nobody knew anything about anything, including schizophrenia. And so it's an extraordinary story of the family and how impossible it was for them to deal with this. There were no sort of places they could go for guidance or anything else like that. But the Galvin family really instrumental in everything that we know about schizophrenia. Helen McDonald wrote a book called H is for Hawk, a really exceptionally interesting book. And this is her new book, and it's called Vesper Flights. And it's a collection of her mostly nature writing, but other essays that she's written. And really the writing is sparkling. The subject matter is really fascinating. And wow, look at that. Miraculously enough, a glass of water has materialized right here by my computer. Thank you, Danielle. So yes, Helen McDonald, bravo. And speaking of bizarre nature, Merlin Sheldrake, who's the son of Roland Sheldrake, who's another wild man. Anyway, Merlin Sheldrake has written a book about fungus, and this might be one of the most fascinating, extraordinary, unbelievable books that you're going to read during the course of this year. This is cutting edge experimental biology, or botany, biology, and it talks about what funguses are and how they react, but it also talks about how they manage to influence what we think of as higher orders of life. Just a dazzling book. Becoming Duchess Goldblatt, you'll know, despite the fact that I'm on Zoom, that I'm not really particularly proficient at technology or social media. But anyway, the author of this book, who for all intents and purposes, well, is certainly unknown to me, but she may be known to some other people. Her life started to fall apart. Her husband left her, and she had a kid that she had to share with her husband, and her husband had a new girlfriend, and her job, she lost her job, and most of her friends, most of her and her husband friends turned out to be her husband's friends, so she didn't have any friends, and while she was kind of casting about in a state of despondency, she decided to create an online persona called Duchess Goldblatt. And the first one didn't work, so she went to another platform, and I have no idea how these things work. But anyway, as her life spiraled downward, Duchess Goldblatt, who would post every now and then little tidbits of alleged wisdom, Duchess Goldblatt became very, very popular online. And so this is a book about how those two things come together. And you know, I think that this would be a really great book club book in its own way. You know, I was reading it and I said, this is just fantastic. And I gave it to Lynn, and she said, you know, I don't know about this book. Like, I'm not sure about this woman. And I said, yeah, I know. That's really one of the points of the book, is that you're never sure about this woman, because, you know, not only is she writing for Duchess Goldblatt, but she's writing the story of her own life. And I mean, who knows? I mean, she might be even crazier than it appears on the page. But anyway, I love this book. I love Duchess Goldblatt really a lot, like surprisingly a lot. And I like the book. And in the end, it kind of glows in ways that you don't really expect. And the final book, I think sometime during the past couple of years, I talked about, there was a book about Princess Margaret called 50 Glimpses of Princess Margaret. And this is a book by Anne Glenn Connor, who was a lady in waiting to Princess Margaret, who was in the wedding party for for the marriage of Queen Elizabeth, and who grew up as the daughter of the Earl of Leicester. And of course, being a woman, she had no claim on anything. And so she became a salesperson for a China company. And then she got married to a guy named Colin Tennant, who was a psychopath. And really, it's extraordinary that she managed to survive that marriage. This guy was so nuts. It's unbelievable. He bought the island of Mystique and turned it into a tourist destination. But you know, like, part of this book, you're thinking, okay, like, is this the life of the British upper class? Because it's even more bizarre than you might have considered possible. But it really is fascinating in its own salacious way. And ultimately, I found this woman admirable for all her frailties and missteps. I thought that in the end she comes off as being an admirable personality. And that's it for the nonfiction. The first book on the fiction side is The Mirror and the Light by Hilary Mantel, which did not make the Booker shortlist. We found out yesterday. But this is the culmination of her spectacular biography of Thomas Cromwell. And you know, the first two volumes dealt with his ascendancy, and of course, in the end, there was the downfall. And that's what this is, sort of eminence grise of Henry VIII. And you knew always that he was in for the chop. And unfortunately, this book was released just as the virus became public knowledge. And so Hilary Mantel had to cancel her events. And the book really didn't find the readership that it deserved, because all of a sudden people didn't really want to read about somebody having a terrible downfall. So at some point further along the road, this trilogy, which started with Wilf Hall, is going to be really a lot more popular than it has been now. But the writing is superlative. The insight is extraordinary, and Hilary Mantel, I mean, really, the fact that you didn't make the Booker Prize, I think, is somewhat surprising. And here's another book that didn't make the Booker shortlist. Like Hilary Mantel, it was on the long list. This is a book by Colin McCann, and this is really a luminous book. It's based on a true story. A Palestinian man and an Israeli man, and the Palestinian man lost his daughter to an Israeli soldier, killed his daughter, and the Israeli man lost his daughter to a Palestinian attack, and so rather than just submit to the hatred and the violence and the vitriol that are so common, these guys ended up in a group of people who had lost children to the other side, and they ended up working together, and they traveled around talking about forgiveness and about peace and about hopefulness, and really and truly, it's a spectacular book. It really sort of makes you see things up close, and you know, it's funny because you know, there's this sense that you shouldn't write about things that you're not. And so here you have this Irish guy who lives in the United States, writing from the point of view of a Palestinian and an Israeli, and I think it's just really beautiful. It's really well put together, and I think it really brings up what a misguided notion it is that you can't write about something that you know. I thought I'd put Louise Penny in here because she's so nice. She really is a wonderful person, and she's had her own devils over the years. And you know, her Inspector Gamache is phenomenally popular, and like there's so many books that she's written, and this is the first one that doesn't take place in Quebec. In this particular one, Gamache goes to Paris and witnesses something that Gamache doesn't think is an accident. Good old Louise Penny, I wish her absolutely the best. She's a wonderful person. And Lionel Shriver, who's sort of a little bit right-wing, but who's also extremely coherent and articulate, and another person who really thinks that it's an error to tell people that, you know, fiction writers especially, that they shouldn't have license to write about things of their imagination, including things that they're not. I mean, at one point she said she's just not interested in writing about a 60-year-old white woman, which is what she is. But this is her new book, and it's called The Motion of the Body Through Space. And it's about a guy who retires early, and then in his 60s decided that he wants to run a marathon. And so he gets a trainer, and then, you know, these men, sometimes they get so deluded. And so this is Lionel Shriver's acid look at that kind of relationship that shows up. There have been a few books that I've read recently by not really young, but not even middle-aged women. And this one by Lynn Seeger-Strong called Want, one of my favorite, this is an extraordinarily powerful book. And it's about a woman who you would think, like, from the outside, looks like she has a great life. She's a teacher, and she has kids, and her parents are pretty affluent. She's come from an affluent background. But there she is, living in the city. She's had to declare bankruptcy. She can't afford anything. And what looks from the outside like a very satisfactory and fulfilling life is anything but. And Lynn Strong captures this so in such crystal clarity. It really is excellent. And I love the voice. I love the story of the book. And I loved how she manages to capture the dislocation that sometimes trying to do what you think is right in these troubled times. Yagi Yassi wrote a book called The Homecoming, which was an extremely successful book. And in fact, one of the most popular book club books that we know about. It was constantly being bought from us in sort of quantities of 8 to 10. And this is a book about a family from Ghana who live in the United States. And that's her background. So she actually does know what she's talking about. She was born in Ghana and raised in Alabama, and that's kind of what Homecoming was about. But this is a book about a family that suffers from all the ills of contemporary America, OxyContin, you know, terrorist tendencies, all that kind of thing. And it is it's very powerful in its own way as well. So again, highly recommended. It's one of the favorite books among the people who work around here. Follow Me to Ground by Sue Rainsford. This is a book that really took me by surprise. Like from the first page, you realize that you have to accept as a given something that is really unusual and really sort of beyond your ken. And it stays true to that premise throughout. It really is dazzling. It's kind of hard to figure out exactly where it's set and in exactly what the situation is among the people who feature in it, but really a special book in terms of its imagination and in terms of its ability to carry through on an unusual premise satisfactorily to the end. I just loved it, and I thought that it even ended in a proper way. Sometimes books like this, like they just have to try and figure out a way to wrap it up. This book ends very convincingly. Elena Ferrante. This is one of the most hotly anticipated books of the year, and I have two books in a row involving Italian teenage women, and this one I like this one really a lot. It is, I suppose, somewhat unsettling in its candor about female sexuality and female expectations and female, like not just female, but dissatisfaction with some of the ways that things are expected. And it's very convincing, and it's about a woman who grows up in a family that seems to be extremely happy and considerate, but turns out to be not quite like that. And it takes place in Naples, where there are actually two parts of the city, sort of Upper Naples, which is civilized and refined, and Lower Naples, where this woman's aunt lives. And so there's a conflict of a social nature as well as a conflict within the character herself. And the second book, an even younger woman, also in Italy, this time in Tuscany, and again, like the difference between social strata in Italy come to the fore here, and a young woman who has to navigate the difficulties between two quite disparate ways of life in this particular book. There's an artistic factor, the French-American artist who's making a sculpture garden, and the Garden of Monsters. Joseph O'Connor's been writing for a long time, and this is his most recent book. It was published in England last year and only published here now, called Shadow Play. And it's a book about the British actor in Victoria, London, called Henry Irving, and Ellen Terry, who's his muse and his leading lady. And Henry Irving is really manic and extraordinarily talented and really the most important and influential actor of his time. And he gets a letter from a guy who really admires his work, and he invites that guy to come, and then says, well, here, I can hire you. You can be my stage manager because I'm going to open a new theater. And the guy who becomes this stage manager is a guy named Bram Stoker. And so this is Bram Stoker trying to be a writer, but also being the manager of a theater, and absolutely brilliant, fantastic writing, extremely confidently plotted, and again, memorable in so many different ways. Migrations by Charlotte McConaughey. I love this book. It's it's set in a sort of near future where more and more animals are extinct or disappearing or endangered. And it's the story of a woman who wants to follow the southern migration of the Arctic tern. And the Arctic tern flies from the Arctic to the Antarctic, and from the Antarctic back to the Arctic every year. And it's the longest migration. It said, if it lived for 20 years, it would fly the distance between Earth and the moon or something like that. But the reason that this woman wants to follow this migration has to do with her own past life and her own circumstances right now. She's a bit of a drifter. She's a bit of a problem psychologically, and so there are lots. It's told in various parts of her life, and it's really, really well done. It's absolutely brilliant. Emily St. John Mandel, this made the Giller long list. She wrote a book called Station 11, which is one of the best books of 3 or 4 years ago, whatever that was. This is her new book, and it's a story of a woman who grows up on the west coast of Canada, and her mother has disappeared, and she has a brother, and so she becomes sort of artistic. And then when she's tending bar in this resort in BC, and she meets a guy who's phenomenally wealthy, and who's based on Bernie Madoff, and so this is a back and forth novel about this very unusual woman, and a couple of people have told me that they found it kind of hard to sympathize with the woman, and I think that's really the point of the book, tell you the truth. But again, really well written, and really, really well put together, and very confidently put together. Valerie Perrine's book, Fresh Water for Flowers. I love this book. It's I think everybody who's read this book loves this book. It's a woman who becomes a caretaker in a cemetery in a small town in Burgundy, and she has her reasons to be quite happy at being tucked away in this unusual place. She writes very lovingly about the place where she lives, and about the people who work in the cemetery, and about her job, and again, the kind of book where the explorations of her past life explain to you gradually how she came to be in this place, and again, a book. So I'm so grateful, a book that ends with a rainbow rather than with a disaster. I love this book. I thought it was very sensitive and very loving in its own way. James Meek, this is a tricky little book because it was published in England last year, and I really can't understand how the English don't reward books about England. And this is a book that takes place in 1348, and there's a guy who's working on an estate, and he wants to go off and fight the French. And it takes a while to get into this book because the language is so unusual. There are different names for things, and I think it's probably genuine, an actual realistic interpretation of how people spoke in the 14th century. But it turns out to be have a lot of very, very telling contemporary resonance. Really a great book, and really well put together, and some humor in it, and just really a lot to recommend it. One of the best historical novels I've read in a long time. Hamnet and Judith, this is called HAMNET only in the UK, and it is one of the most powerful books I've read. I think it might be ultimately the best book I've read all year. The prose is muscular. The character, the protagonist, who's the mother of Hamnet and Judith, is so well portrayed from the time she's young until the time she's older. And you know, I don't usually like reading books in which young people die, but this particular book really is memorable in its portrayal, not just of that particular experience, but the entire story of this woman. She's so well portrayed. I can't get over it. And you know, like, it make you cry, but at the end, when you put it down, you just think that was such an extraordinary book. It really is miraculous how she managed to get inside the head of this person. And finally, Ali Smith, lucky you. This is the fourth book in the seasonal quartet that Ali Smith has been writing for the past 4 years, I guess. And the good news is you don't have to read all of the other books. But the even better news is that you can read them all in a row, should you so desire. I have not read any of the other ones, but I love this book. It is so excellent and so up to date. And there are ways in which, you know, to her credit, Ali Smith manages to write about things that are potentially disturbing, but in ways that kind of cushion the blow for you. And while they're certainly thought-provoking, again, in the end, this book ends on an extremely positive note, and it was published in July, and it's out already. So I don't know whether she just kept holding on to it. You know, I think because of COVID, it may have been delayed, the publication date, which allowed her to write some really up-to-date stuff in it. But absolutely brilliant book, and again, the kind of book that I think could have great discussions surrounding it. And that's it for me. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Ben, for that. Just a note for folks that you should have received the reading list that Ben was referring to. Check your email for it. If you haven't received it, please send me a note and I'd be happy to resend it. Sometimes things end up in spam, but we'd hate for you to go without that goodie list. Also, we've got about 12 minutes left if folks have questions. I have one to start us off from Barbara. And she asks, Ben, what books are you most anticipating that aren't in print yet, especially fiction, but nonfiction and memoir/biography?
Well, there's a new book coming by Katsuo Ishiguro, but I think it might not be coming out until the springtime. There's a new book from Margaret Macmillan, always somebody who you want to be, who you want to read. Although this book is about war, and I don't know how thrilled I'm going to be reading about war. There's a book by Barbara Emile, which from a business standpoint is probably going to be one of the big books for us this year, in which she tells all, and doesn't she have a lot to tell? What else? There's a new book by Sarah Moss. The really frustrating stuff for me is that I'm seeing books that are published in England. There's a book by Polly Sampson, which takes place on the island of Hydra and involves Leonard Cohen, but Leonard Cohen in a very minor role compared to the leading characters in the book. There's a new book by Rachel Joyce that I really can't wait to read. But it's out in England as well. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff coming forward, and that's why I thought it was worthwhile talking about A Month in Siena. You know, lots of times books that turn out to be really important to me, I don't think about so much because I don't talk to you guys until September.
Mm-hmm. So that's it for questions right now, but I know one question that a lot of folks had last year, things were up in the air in terms of your store, and everyone was sort of waiting with bated breath to see how things were going to turn out. So you're in a new space now. How are things going for you?
Well, it's interesting, Nora. Our lease was up at the end of August, and fortunately for us, our lease was up in the end of August. I mean, if you look around, you might be able to see behind me some of this stuff. We're in a new location. We're here until January, and I think that if we had 3 more years to go on the lease that was terminated by our landlord at the end of August, that we probably would have to go out of business because the way things have gone, it's no picnic out there in retail, and we had a very large amount of rent that we had to pay every month on Bay Street, and I was there for the month of July and the month of August, and there was nobody downtown. I mean, there was nobody downtown Toronto.
Yeah.
And if you went into the neighborhoods, they were packed. I mean, you could barely, you were concerned about social distancing walking along the street in the neighborhoods, and downtown on Bay Street, there was nobody there. The bank towers, the office towers had been basically hollowed out. Nobody was coming to work. And in fact, it even started earlier for us downtown because a lot of those companies were way ahead of the curve in terms of getting people working from home. Like,
right.
We started to see it in February, and like way before we had to close down.
Oh, wow.
And so, we found ourselves a little spot here on Adelaide Street, which is much smaller and much easier for us to deal with. And I think, I think that in terms of retail rents, things are going to get a lot worse before they get better. And landlords are still, like, we're still seeing listings for things that where the rent that they're asking is the same rent that they were asking last November. And I mean, these places have been empty. Nobody's coming around to look at them. And I think sooner or later, some sense of reality is going to have to set in. And if and when that happens, then we'll be in a better position to see, where we want to end up. But for us, I think the most surprising thing was how empty it was downtown. I mean, we're really wondering if there's any need for us to be, if there's any reason for us to even be downtown anymore, if it's going to be really expensive to be there.
Right. Yeah. I mean, because you are a destination for people too. Right?
Well, actually, it's interesting because when we reopened, like, we locked down for 10 weeks, like non-essential business. And when we reopened, when we said to people, okay, like, you can order books from us and you can come and pick them up, like, we heard from people that we'd never heard of, like, we didn't even know who they were. So in fact, we have customers, we have a lot of customers, and now we just sent out a newsletter today saying, okay, like, we think that you'll be able to come and do appointment shopping starting Monday. And the calendar is pretty much full in terms of people who want to make an appointment to come in to shop. So as long as there's not a big sort of uptick in terms of cases, I mean, I think we might be in a place where it's actually good for us to be, at least in the short term.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Yeah. That's what we want to hear. I do have a question from Doriana, and you referred to it a couple times, but what's your opinion on the Booker list that was just announced?
Well, I'm always surprised at the lack of British books, like books about the British experience. Like Hilary Mantel won the Booker Prize for the first 2 books in this series. This is as good, if not better, than the first 2. It's not really there, and I can't really say that the books that are on it don't deserve to be on it, because they haven't been easy to get. One of them is quite old, as a matter of fact. It's been available in North America for a couple of years. But the fact that Hamnet and Judith was not even on the long list, for me, I found that really frightful, to tell you the truth. I just thought, okay, whatever's happening in terms of juries, it's not really something that I have a lot of understanding of. I don't really get it. You know, it's quite possible these books are going to be really great, but you know, in terms of staying power, you know, like a lot of the recent Booker winners have become completely insignificant within 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Girl, Woman, Other has actually had a bit of a stick to it. It's actually a pretty interesting book. It really is interesting in a lot of ways. But really, if I were to say to you, okay, name me the past 10 Booker winners,
Right.
you'd have a lot of difficulty doing that.
Mm-hmm. As a follow-up question to that, there's a question: was there a Canadian book that should have made the Booker shortlist, in your opinion?
No, not that I know of.
No.
No, I don't think so. I think in fact that the Giller list is, you know, I don't think there's a lot of, I don't know if there are a lot of great books out there this year. Mm-hmm. from the Canadian side, tell you the truth. And you know, like I think there's a lot of difficulty in terms of timing now, because a lot of books like were delayed, and like what year are they in and things like that. Like this Ali Smith book, believe me, it really is a brilliant book, but I mean, it wasn't published until September, so I don't know, like maybe it's not even there. And so I think from the Canadian side as well, there may be some problems with timing. I don't really know how they managed to sort all that stuff out.
Great. Yeah, I know even for us, for programming the festival this year, there were a lot of people on our radar that suddenly got switched to a 2021 publication date. So
yeah, well, I you know, I'm a judge on the City of Toronto Book Awards, mm-hmm. and you know, like there was a deadline for when the books were going to come in, and then books came in after that, and then books came in after that, and then books came in after that and after that. So you know, I think there's a lot of you know, like a lot of publishers aren't even working from their office anymore, right? So these are really difficult times. I don't know. I think the fact that some of these books are published now, maybe it's an indication that the publishers really were sort of holding them back until it sort of came to when they really had to deal with it.
Right. I guess a contrast to that, and that's a question we just got, was what about Emma's The Pull of the Stars, Emma Donoghue, which ended up being an incredibly timely book, yeah. If not intentionally. So, yeah.
I love Emma Donoghue.
Yeah. Yeah,
and I think you know, it'll be really interesting to see what the Giller shortlist turns out to be, because mm-hmm. you know, I think this business of deliberations for juries, you know, it's always a crapshoot. You never know what's going to be involved there, and like my sense is that you know, for the most part, the winner's decided by a very narrow margin, mm-hmm. And there are people who, you know, there are people on the juries who just say, yeah, you know what, I'm okay with that. I'm not gonna argue really strenuously for something, and so quite often the people who have the strongest feelings about things have their way. And yeah, I'm already in trouble having said this much in terms of politics.
We have about a minute left, and maybe this is a question that you might not want to answer then, but someone was asking who your favorite Kingston authors are. Can you choose?
Oh, you know, yeah, you know, I'm not sure. I think you're doing an event with Desmond Cole, right? Yeah. That's a really powerful book. You know, I mean, it's not a fun read by any stretch of the imagination, but in terms of shattering our complacency certainly as a city, but I think also as a country, I think that book has a lot to offer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that brings us to the end of our hour. Can
I just say thanks to everybody. Thanks to the people who are putting up with me for an hour. And thanks to you guys, as always,
Yeah.
for letting me be part of this. I love your festival. I think you guys have done a fantastic job always.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Ben. It's no exaggeration to say that you are one of our audience's favorites and one of our favorite people to welcome to the festival year after year. And I know there's always a lot of excitement about the suggestions that you have. So thank you for taking the time to be with us today remotely. Just a reminder to everyone that you can check out the books that Ben has recommended at Novel Idea in Kingston, Ben McNally Books in Toronto, or your local independent bookstore. And be sure to join us on Wednesday of next week for Kingston WritersFest 2020. So we hope to see you there. All right.
Thanks, Zara.
All right. Thank you.